Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I know you use this video to fall asleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what city are you watching? I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, let's dive in. The emergency broadcast had been looping for 3 hours when I finally turned off the television. Sarah pressed her face against the living room window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the Henderson house across the street. Nothing moved in their yard except the automatic sprinklers, still dutifully watering the petunias. "Mom, why aren't they answering their door?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. At 14, Sarah was old enough to understand that something was terribly wrong, but young enough to still look to me for answers I didn't have. "They're probably just scared, honey, like everyone else." I pulled her away from the window and drew the curtains closed. The late afternoon sun cast everything in an amber glow that should have been comforting, but somehow felt ominous instead. The radio crackled from the kitchen counter. Reports of violent attacks spreading rapidly through the downtown area. Citizens are advised to remain indoors and avoid contact with... Static consumed the rest. My husband David emerged from his home office, phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale, jaw tight with tension. "Yeah, I understand. No, we're secure here. The neighborhood's quiet." He caught my eye and shook his head grimly. "Okay, call if anything changes." "Work?" I asked as he ended the call. "The hospital's in chaos. Dr. Reeves says they've had to barricade the emergency room. People are changing, attacking staff, other patients." He ran his hands through his graying hair. "They want me to stay home until this passes." David was a psychiatrist at Mercy General. In 20 years of marriage, I'd never seen him look so shaken. He'd dealt with violent patients before, talked down schizophrenics having psychotic breaks, worked with criminals deemed legally insane. But this was different. "Changing how?" Sarah had crept back toward us, her voice barely above a whisper. David and I exchanged glances. How do you explain the impossible to a child? How do you describe what the news was calling a viral outbreak when the infected seemed more dead than alive, more monster than human? "Some people are getting very sick," I said carefully, "and when they're sick, they don't act like themselves anymore." "Like Grandpa did? Before he died?" The memory of David's father in his final months stung. The confusion, the paranoia, the way he'd sometimes look at us like strangers. But this wasn't dementia. "Not exactly like that," David said, "but you don't need to worry about it. We're safe here." He said it with such conviction that I almost believed him. The power went out during our dinner of canned soup and crackers. Sarah's fork clattered against her bowl in the sudden darkness. "It's okay," I said quickly, fumbling for the flashlight we'd placed on the counter. "Just a power outage. Happens all the time during storms." But there was no storm. The evening had been clear and still. David found the battery-powered radio and tuned it to the emergency frequency. The signal was weaker now, fragmented. Containment efforts have failed. Military deployment in Sector 7. Avoid all contact. "The Hendersons still haven't come outside," Sarah said. She'd been keeping vigil at various windows throughout the day, documenting the growing stillness in our usually bustling neighborhood. "And the Garcia's dog has been barking all day, but I can't see Bruno anywhere in their yard." I'd noticed it too. The absence of normal life. No children playing in driveways, no joggers, no lawnmowers humming. Even the mail truck hadn't made its rounds. "Maybe they evacuated," I suggested, though I couldn't remember hearing any evacuation orders for our area. David was studying a hand-drawn map he'd created, marking off each house on our street with different colored pens. Red for no activity, yellow for uncertain, green for signs of life. Our street was mostly red now, with only a few yellow marks. We were the only green. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "A contagion this virulent should have clear vectors. We should be seeing more obvious signs of—" A crash from outside cut him off. Through the kitchen window, I could see garbage cans overturned in the Hendersons' driveway. Something dark was moving between the shadows of their hedge. "Stay here," David whispered, grabbing the baseball bat we'd taken to keepin' by the front door. But as he approached the window, the movement stopped. Whatever had been there was gone. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, but his knuckles were white around the bat's handle. That night, as Sarah slept between us in our bed, I listened to the sounds outside. Or rather, the lack of them. No distant traffic, no hum of air conditioners, no bark of dogs. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the windows like something alive. David's breathing was too controlled, too measured. He was awake too. "David? How long do you think we can stay like this?" A long pause. "As long as we need to." But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Our food supplies were running lower than I'd admitted to the others. The canned goods I'd thought would last us 2 weeks were disappearing faster than anticipated. Sarah was a growing teenager, and stress seemed to increase everyone's appetite. I was taking inventory in the pantry when I heard David's voice from the living room, low and urgent. I crept closer and found him on his cell phone. Somehow he still had signal when mine had died days ago. "Yes, I understand the risks, but we need supplies. My family—" He paused, listening. "No, I haven't seen any signs of infection in this area. The neighborhood appears clear." My stomach clenched. Who was he talking to? "Thursday night? That soon?" Another pause. "Understood. Same extraction point?" Extraction point? He ended the call just as I stepped into the room. His face went through a quick transformation. Surprise, then something that might have been guilt, then his usual composed mask. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work. They're organizing relief efforts for unaffected areas." Relief efforts? Food drops, medical supplies. They think this might be over soon. Something in his tone didn't match his words. David had always been a careful speaker, weighing each word, but now there was an artificial quality to his reassurance. "That's wonderful news," I said carefully. "When?" "Soon, maybe by the weekend." But I'd heard him say Thursday night. Today was Tuesday. That evening, while Sarah showered and David claimed to be checking our security measures, I went through his office. I told myself I was looking for anything that might help our situation. Emergency contacts, medical supplies, information about what was really happening out there. What I found was a locked desk drawer that hadn't been locked before. The key was hidden in his coffee mug, exactly where he'd kept it for years. David was a creature of habit, even in a crisis. Inside the drawer were documents I didn't understand. Medical forms, consent papers, something that looked like a legal waiver. All bore official letterheads from David's hospital, but from departments I'd never heard him mention. The dates were recent, some from just days ago. At the bottom was a handwritten note in David's precise script. Subject exhibits no signs of infection. Emotional attachment remains strong. Recommend proceeding with Protocol 7 as discussed. Subject? Protocol 7? My hands were shaking as I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I locked the drawer, replaced the key, and returned to the kitchen where I sat staring at my cold coffee until David returned. "Everything secure?" I asked. "All good," he said, kissing the top of my head. "We're perfectly safe here." The word subject echoed in my mind. Sarah found the first body. I was hanging laundry on the back porch. We'd been conserving the generator's fuel when I heard her scream from the garden. She was standing frozen by the tomato plants, pointing at something in the tall grass near the fence. It was Mrs. Chen from 2 streets over. I recognized her floral housecoat, though her face was turned away from us. She lay perfectly still, arms at her sides, as if she'd simply lain down for a nap in our backyard. "Don't touch her," I said sharply as Sarah started forward. David, come quick." He emerged from the house with that bat in his hand, moving with a confidence that seemed almost practiced. But when he saw Mrs. Chen, his expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "How long do you think she's been there?" I asked. "Hard to say. Could be days." He crouched beside the body, not touching but examining. No obvious signs of trauma, no blood. "Shouldn't we call someone?" "Call who? The phones are down, remember?" But his phone had worked just 3 days ago. "We should at least cover her up," Sarah said. She was crying quietly, probably thinking of her own grandmother. "No," David said firmly. "We don't touch anything. We don't know how the infection spreads. But she's just lying there. Sarah." His voice carried a warning that made her step back. "We follow the protocols. We stay safe." Protocols. Like the protocol Seven mentioned in his notes. That night, I watched from our bedroom window as David went outside alone. He spent a long time by Mrs. Chen's body, but from my angle I couldn't see what he was doing. When he came back inside, he was carrying a small bag I hadn't seen before. "What were you doing out there?" I asked as he quietly entered our room. "Just checking the perimeter, making sure we're secure." But he wouldn't meet my eyes, and when I looked out the window again, Mrs. Chen's body was gone. The nightmares started that night. In my dreams, I was walking through our house, but it was different somehow. The walls breathed, the floors shifted beneath my feet, and everywhere I looked, there were eyes watching me from dark corners, from behind partially closed doors, from the spaces between furniture. I would call for Sarah and David, but my voice made no sound. I would run toward Sarah's room, but the hallway stretched longer and longer, the door receding into impossible distance. And always, at the end of these dreams, I would find myself back in our bedroom, staring at David's sleeping form. But in the dream, his face would be wrong, features subtly rearranged, like a photograph that had been torn and reassembled by someone who only half remembered what he was supposed to look like. I woke gasping, David's hand gentle on my shoulder. "Another nightmare?" he asked softly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "It's the stress. Perfectly normal under the circumstances." His voice was soothing, professional. "Your mind is trying to process trauma in the only way it knows how." But as he spoke, all I could think about were those papers in his desk drawer. Subject exhibits no signs of infection. "David," I said slowly, "what exactly do you think is happening out there?" "With the outbreak?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I think people are getting sick, and when they get sick, they become dangerous." "But what kind of sickness makes people act like zombies?" "Zombies?" He almost smiled. "Is that what you think they are? The news reports, the videos online before the internet went down, people attacking others, not responding to pain or reason. The mind can be fragile, Helen. Trauma can break it in ways that make people seem like different species entirely. His hand found mine in the darkness. But we're safe here. I'm a doctor. I know the signs to watch for. What signs? Paranoia, seeing threats where none exist, inability to trust even the people closest to you. The way he said it made my blood run cold. I started paying closer attention to Sarah. It was small things at first. The way she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing. How she'd taken to spending long periods in her room with the door closed. The fact that she'd stopped asking about her friends, about school, about when things would go back to normal. When I brought her lunch, I found her sitting on her bed, perfectly still, staring at the wall. "Honey, are you feeling okay?" She turned to look at me, and for just a moment her expression was completely blank. Then she smiled, but it was the wrong smile, too wide and held too long. "I'm fine, Mom, just thinking." "About what?" "About how nice it is here, how safe we are." The smile never wavered. "Dad says we might never have to leave." A chill ran down my spine. Never have to leave? If the outside world gets too dangerous, we could just stay here forever. Just the three of us. Wouldn't that be perfect? The way she said perfect made it sound like she was reciting from a script. That evening, I cornered David in the kitchen. "Have you been talking to Sarah about staying here permanently? I might have mentioned that we're better off here than out there. Is that a problem?" She seems different, distant. She's processing trauma in her own way. Children are remarkably resilient. He dried a dish with methodical precision. Though we should watch for signs of infection, of course. What signs? Increased aggression, paranoid ideation, distrust of family members. I stared at him. "You keep saying that." "Saying what?" "About paranoia, about not trusting family. It's like you want me to think I'm losing my mind." David set down the dish and turned to face me fully. His expression was kind, concerned, perfectly controlled. "Helen, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You've been under enormous stress. You've been having nightmares. You've been asking increasingly suspicious questions about my work, my phone calls, my activities." He reached out and touched my face gently. "These are all early warning signs." Warning signs of what? Of the psychological breakdown that precedes the physical transformation. The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. That's not how this works. The report said it was viral, that people just suddenly... The reports were wrong, or incomplete. His voice remained calm, clinical. The infection begins in the mind. Paranoia, distrust, inability to distinguish reality from delusion. Only then does the physical deterioration begin. I stepped back from his touch. "You're trying to make me think I'm crazy. I'm trying to help you recognize the symptoms before they progress too far." He followed me as I backed toward the doorway. "Helen, you found Mrs. Chen's body and immediately assumed I had something to do with her death. You searched through my private papers. You're questioning my every word, my every action. Because you're acting suspicious. Or because you're becoming paranoid." I ran from the kitchen, from his calm, reasonable voice, from the terrible logic of his words. In the living room, I found Sarah still sitting in that same position on the couch, staring at nothing. "Sarah," I whispered urgently. "Sarah, we need to talk." She turned to look at me with that same too wide smile. "What is it, Mom? How do you feel?" Really feel, not what Dad told you to feel. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, confusion, but then the smile returned. I feel safe, Mom. I feel perfect. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. Not by external threats, but by the people sharing my home. David's breathing beside me seemed too measured, too controlled. Sometimes I would catch him lying perfectly still, but I could sense his wakefulness in the darkness. During the day, I began to notice patterns. How David and Sarah would sometimes exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. How conversations would stop when I entered a room. How they both seemed to know things about our situation that I didn't. The food situation had become critical. We were down to crackers, some canned soup, and the emergency water supply. I mentioned this to David, expecting him to share my concern. Instead, he just nodded calmly. Don't worry about that. Don't worry. We'll starve in a few days. No, we won't. How can you be so sure? Because help is coming. When? From where? He looked at me with that same expression he used with his most delusional patients. Patient, kind, and utterly condescending. Helen, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? But I couldn't. Because trust required believing that the person you're trusting has your best interests at heart. And, increasingly, I wasn't sure David did. That night, I heard sounds from downstairs. Quiet footsteps, whispered conversation, the front door opening and closing. I crept to the window and saw David in the yard, talking to someone I couldn't make out in the darkness. They handed him something, a bag or package, and then melted back into the shadows. When David returned, I pretended to be asleep. He moved through the house quietly, efficiently, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. In the morning, our food supplies had mysteriously replenished. Fresh fruit, vegetables, even milk that should have been impossible to find. Where did this come from? I asked. I made contact with the relief station, David said. They're providing supplies to uninfected families. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to get your hopes up in case it fell through. But Sarah was watching this exchange with an odd expression, like someone watching a play she'd seen many times before. 3 weeks. We'd been trapped in our home for 3 weeks, and I was beginning to understand that the trap wasn't the zombie outbreak outside. It was the people inside with me. I found the camera while looking for batteries in David's office. It was small, professional grade, hidden behind books on his shelf. When I examined it, I could see it was positioned to capture most of the room, including the chair where I'd been sitting during our recent conversations. My hands shook as I searched further. I found 2 more cameras, one in the kitchen, one in the living room, all positioned to observe me. In his locked drawer, which I accessed again with growing desperation, I found new documents, observation logs, video timestamps, behavioral analysis reports. Day 12. Subject shows increased paranoid behavior, searched personal effects, recommended escalating to Phase 2. Day 15. Subject exhibits classic pre-transformation anxiety. Daughter responding well to conditioning protocol. Day 18. Subject's reality testing significantly impaired, ready for final phase. Subject, always subject, never my wife or Helen. Subject, I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear David's footsteps until it was too late. Find what you were looking for, he asked from the doorway. I spun around, papers scattering. What is this? What are you doing to us? He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. I'm documenting a very important case study. Case study? The psychological breakdown of a previously stable individual under extreme stress. It's fascinating, really, how quickly the human mind can fracture when its basic assumptions about reality are challenged. I backed toward the window, but he moved to block my path. "You see, Helen, there never was a zombie outbreak." The words hit me like a physical blow. What? Oh, there were reports of one. Carefully orchestrated reports. Social media posts, emergency broadcasts, news footage, all very convincing. His voice was calm, almost proud. The human mind is remarkably susceptible to mass hysteria when the presentation is authentic enough. That's impossible. The bodies? What bodies? You never actually saw any bodies except Mrs. Chen, and she was, well, she volunteered for the research. Terminal cancer. Wanted to contribute to science in her final days. The room seemed to spin around me. The sounds outside, the empty neighborhood, evacuation drill. Perfectly legal. All residents were compensated for their participation. They're staying in hotels downtown, probably having a lovely vacation. I stared at him in horror. Sarah. What did you do to Sarah? Sarah is fine. She's been taking a mild anxiolytic I've been putting in her food. Keeps her calm, suggestible. She genuinely believes we're in danger, but she's not experiencing the psychological trauma you are because her anxiety is being chemically managed. You drugged our daughter? I medicated her. There's a difference. He took a step closer. The question now is whether you're going to accept treatment as well, or if we need to move to more aggressive intervention. I lunged for the door, but David caught my arm easily. His grip was firm, but not painful. He was still playing the role of concerned husband. Helen, listen to me. You're having a psychotic break. The paranoia, the conspiracy theories about your own family, these are symptoms. I can help you, but you need to let me. By drugging me? By lying to me? By providing you with a controlled environment where we can study your progression and hopefully develop better treatments for others like you. Others like me? People who break under pressure, who become dangerous to themselves and their families. His voice was still gentle, still reasonable. You searched my private papers. You've been watching me suspiciously for days. How long before you decide I'm a threat? How long before you hurt Sarah because you think she's been compromised? The terrible thing was that his words made a sick kind of sense. Had I been losing my grip on reality? Were the cameras and documents I'd found real, or elaborate delusions constructed by my fracturing mind? I want to see the outside, I said desperately. I want to open the front door and see for myself. Of course you do. That's exactly what someone in your condition would want. Proof of the conspiracy, evidence to validate your paranoid delusions. He was steering me gently, but inexorably toward a chair. But what happens when you open that door and see a perfectly normal neighborhood? Will you accept that you've been wrong? Or will you simply construct new delusions to explain away the evidence? I didn't have an answer for that. They kept me sedated for most of the next day. Whatever David had given me left me floating in a hazy half-consciousness where thoughts moved like thick honey. I was dimly aware of voices, of being moved from room to room, of Sarah's face appearing and disappearing above me like a concerned angel. When I finally fought my way back to full awareness, I found myself in our bedroom. The curtains were drawn and the door was locked from the outside. I was a prisoner in my own home. But clarity was returning with sobriety, and I began to think more strategically. David was right about one thing. I had been acting paranoid and suspicious. But paranoid didn't mean wrong. Even if I was losing my grip on reality, the evidence I'd found was real. The cameras, the documents, the systematic deception. Unless they weren't. Unless my mind had constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain the unexplainable. The only way to know for sure was to get outside, to see the world beyond our artificial bubble. I waited until the house was quiet, then began working on the bedroom window. The lock was old, and I remembered how Sarah used to sneak out to meet friends before the outbreak. If a teenager could manage it, so could I. The window opened with barely a whisper. I dropped into the flower bed below, my bare feet sinking into the soft mulch. The night air was cool on my face, filled with the ordinary sounds of a living neighborhood. Distant traffic, the hum of air conditioners, a dog barking several streets away. All the sounds that had been absent from our world for 3 weeks. I crept around to the front of the house and stopped dead. The street was normal, completely, utterly normal. Porch lights glowed warmly. Cars were parked in driveways. In the Henderson house, I could see the blue flicker of a television through their living room window. They were home. They had always been home. I stood on my front lawn in my nightgown, staring at a neighborhood that showed no signs of apocalypse, no indication that anything had ever been wrong. The Garcia's dog, Bruno, was sleeping peacefully on their front porch. The automatic sprinklers I'd been watching for weeks were running their normal cycle. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant David had been telling the truth about at least one thing. There had never been a zombie outbreak, but that didn't make the rest of his story true. I walked to the Henderson house and knocked on their door. After a moment, Mr. Henderson answered, looking perfectly normal and mildly annoyed at being woken up. "Helen, what are you doing out here? It's 2 a.m. "Jim," I said carefully, "how long has it been since you've seen me or my family?" He frowned. "I don't know, maybe a week? David mentioned you were all dealing with some kind of flu. And you never tried to check on us? Never came to the door? David said you were contagious, asked us to keep our distance until you were better." Of course he had. I thanked Jim and walked back toward my house, my mind racing. David had isolated us, convinced Sarah and me that the world was ending while maintaining the illusion for our neighbors that we were simply sick. But why? The answer was waiting for me when I slipped back through the bedroom window. David was sitting in the chair by the door, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Feel better?" he asked. "You lied to me about everything. I told you exactly what you needed to hear to create optimal conditions for the study." "What study? What are you really doing?" He stood and walked to the dresser, where he picked up a thick folder I hadn't seen before. "My research focuses on induced paranoid psychosis. How quickly a stable individual can be driven to complete psychological breakdown through environmental manipulation and carefully constructed false narratives." I stared at him. "You're experimenting on me. On us. Sarah is part of the study too, though she's in the control group. I needed to see how the same stressors would affect someone with pharmaceutical intervention versus someone without. You're using your own family as lab rats. I'm conducting groundbreaking research that will revolutionize our understanding of trauma-induced psychosis." His voice carried the fervor of a true believer. "Do you know how many people suffer from paranoid delusions? How many families are destroyed by unfounded suspicions and conspiracy theories? This research could help millions. By destroying us? By documenting the process. Your progression has been textbook. Initial acceptance of the false narrative, growing suspicion of authority figures, eventual paranoid ideation about your closest family members." He opened the folder and showed me pages of charts, graphs, behavioral observations. You've provided invaluable data. I looked at the papers, at the clinical description of my psychological deterioration, and felt something break inside me. Not my sanity. That was still intact, hanging on by threads of fury and determination. What broke was my last connection to the man I'd thought I'd married. What happens now? I asked. Now we document the resolution phase. How you integrate this new understanding, whether you accept treatment, whether the paranoid ideation continues even after the false narrative is revealed. And Sarah will be fine. The medication has protected her from most of the psychological trauma. In a few days, she'll come off the anxiolytic, and this will seem like a bad dream. A bad dream where her father tortured her mother for science. Necessary research, he corrected, and technically, I haven't tortured anyone. No physical harm, no lasting psychological damage if you accept appropriate treatment. But he was wrong about the lasting damage. I could feel it spreading through me like poison. The knowledge that the person I'd trusted most in the world had systematically destroyed my sense of reality. That he'd watched me suffer and taken notes. That he'd involved our daughter in his sick experiment. That he still believed he was the hero of this story. There's something else, David continued, consulting his notes. I need to understand your current psychological state. When you went outside tonight and saw that the neighborhood was normal, how did that make you feel? I considered lying, but decided on honesty. Confused, betrayed, angry, but not relieved? Most people in your situation would feel relief at discovering their worst fears were unfounded. Most people in my situation haven't just learned their husband is a sociopath. He made a note in his file. Interesting. So, the paranoid ideation has shifted from external threats to internal ones. You now see me as the primary danger. Because you are. Because you need to believe I am. Your mind requires a threat to explain your psychological distress. When the external threat was removed, you simply redirected your paranoia toward me. The circular logic was perfect, unbreakable. Any resistance to his narrative became evidence of the very condition he claimed to be studying. Any attempt to assert my sanity was proof of my insanity. It was brilliant in its way, and it was about to get him killed. I spent the morning playing the role he expected. Confused patient struggling with reality, grateful for her doctor husband's patient care. I asked about treatment options, expressed remorse for my paranoid behavior, even apologized for searching through his papers. David ate it up, making copious notes about my apparent progress. What he didn't realize was that I was studying him just as intently as he'd been studying me. 20 years of marriage had taught me his patterns, his habits, his weaknesses. The way he always had his evening coffee at exactly 9:15. How he took his sleep medication religiously at 10 p.m., a habit he'd developed years ago to combat the insomnia that plagued many psychiatrists. How he always ground the pills himself because he didn't trust pharmaceutical consistency. Sarah was easier. Still chemically docile, she accepted my suggestion that we prepare a special dinner to celebrate getting better. She helped me cook David's favorite meal, chatting dreamily about how nice it would be when everything went back to normal. I prepared David's coffee with special care, adding the ground contents of every sleeping pill in our medicine cabinet. It was risky. Too much could be fatal. But David was a large man, and I needed him unconscious long enough to get Sarah away from the house. He drank it without suspicion, praising me for the thoughtful gesture. Within 30 minutes, he was fighting to keep his eyes open. "I think I'll turn in early," he mumbled, heading toward the stairs. He made it halfway up before collapsing. I checked his pulse, steady and strong. He would live, but he'd be unconscious for hours. Plenty of time for what I needed to do. Sarah found me dragging her father into his office. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Helping him," I said simply. "He's very sick, honey. Sicker than he wants to admit." "Is he going to be okay?" "I hope so, but we need to get him the right kind of help." I positioned David in his desk chair and began setting up his own camera equipment. If he wanted to document psychological breakdown, he was about to get a front row seat to his own. When he woke up 12 hours later, he was strapped to his chair with zip ties, facing his own recording equipment. Sarah sat beside me on the couch across from him, still groggy from the sleeping pills I'd mixed into her morning orange juice. "Helen," David said carefully, testing his restraints, "what are you doing?" "Conducting a case study," I replied, consulting the notebook where I'd been recording my observations. Subject exhibits classic sociopathic traits masked by professional competence. Research question: how does a narcissistic personality disorder manifest when the subject's carefully constructed reality is challenged? This isn't funny. Neither was watching my wife suffer for 3 weeks, I said, but you found that interesting enough to document. David's composure was beginning to crack. "Helen, you're having another episode. The paranoid ideation is getting worse. You need to let me help you." "See, this is fascinating," I told the camera. When confronted with evidence of his own pathology, the subject immediately deflects by claiming his accuser is mentally ill. Classic Darvo response: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. I'm not the victim here. Neither was I, but you made me into one. I showed him his own research notes. 23 days of systematic psychological abuse, isolation, gaslighting, manipulation of environmental factors to induce paranoia. You didn't break my mind, David. You revealed your own sickness. Sarah was watching this exchange with growing clarity. The medication was wearing off, and her natural intelligence was reasserting itself. "Dad," she said slowly, "did you really make us think the world was ending?" David's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with frustration at losing control of his narrative. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "The research was important, revolutionary. The potential applications for treating paranoid disorders? By creating them?" Sarah stood up, backing away from both of us. "By torturing your own family?" "It wasn't torture. It was a controlled study with minimal psychological impact." "Minimal?" I laughed, and even to my own ears it sounded unhinged. "David, you made me question my own sanity. You drugged our daughter. You turned our home into a laboratory and us into specimens. For the greater good, for your career, for your ego, for the thrill of playing God with people's minds." I leaned forward, staring directly into his eyes. "But here's what you didn't account for in your brilliant study. You assumed that if I discovered the truth, I would be relieved, grateful even, that I would see the wisdom of your methods and forgive the deception." David was pulling at his restraints now, no longer maintaining his clinical composure. "Helen, this has gone far enough. Sarah, help me. Your mother's having a complete psychological break." But Sarah wasn't looking at him with concern anymore. She was looking at him with the dawning horror of someone who'd just realized she'd been living with a monster. "How long were you planning to keep us here?" she asked quietly. "The study was supposed to last 6 weeks," David admitted. "Long enough to document complete psychological deterioration and recovery." "Recovery?" I stood up, pacing in front of the camera. You mean the phase where you gaslight me into believing my perfectly rational responses to an insane situation were symptoms of mental illness. They were symptoms. They were survival instincts. I slammed my hand on his desk, making him flinch. Everything I suspected about you was true. The deception, the manipulation, the complete absence of empathy for your own family. I wasn't losing my mind, David. I was finally seeing yours clearly. The terrible thing was watching his face as he processed this, because even now, even tied to a chair with his crimes laid bare, he still believed he was the rational one, the victim of his wife's mental illness. "Helen," he said, his voice taking on that patient, therapeutic tone that had once comforted me, "I understand you're angry, but you need to think about what you're doing. Holding someone against their will is kidnapping, assault. You could go to prison. Could I? Or would I be found not guilty by reason of insanity? After all, you have 23 days of documentation proving I'm mentally unstable." For the first time, real fear flickered across David's features. "You planned this perfectly," I continued, consulting his notes. "Isolated victim, gradual psychological deterioration, professional documentation of the process. If I went to the police now and told them what you'd done, who would they believe? The respected psychiatrist or his paranoid, delusional wife? Sarah would corroborate your story. Would she? Or would she be seen as another victim of her mother's psychotic break? A child so traumatized by her mother's behavior that she's adopted her paranoid delusions. Sarah was crying now, finally understanding the full scope of what had been done to us. Not just the fake apocalypse, but the systematic destruction of our ability to seek help or justice. "You made me complicit," she whispered. "All those times you asked me how Mom was acting, whether she seemed different. You were gathering evidence. David's professional mask was completely gone now. Sarah, you have to understand. Your mother was becoming dangerous. The paranoid ideation, the searching through my papers, the suspicions about my activities, the completely accurate suspicions," I corrected. "Every paranoid thought I had about you turned out to be true. Because I made them true. The study required you to torture your family for science." I turned to the camera. "This is what we're documenting now. Not my breakdown, but his. Watch how he justifies the unjustifiable, how he makes himself the victim of his own crimes." David was struggling against his restraints with real desperation now. "Helen, please, think about what you're doing to Sarah. She's watching her mother have a complete psychotic episode. This will traumatize her for life. More than learning her father is a sociopath who experimented on his own family. I'm not a sociopath. I'm a researcher. I'm trying to help people. By harming us. By advancing the field of... By feeding your God complex," I snapped. "You didn't choose us for this study because we were ideal subjects. You chose us because we were available. Because you had total control over our environment and couldn't lose your test subjects to ethical concerns or informed consent." The room fell silent except for David's heavy breathing and Sarah's quiet sobs. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. It was the same question I'd asked David yesterday, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. "Now we decide what kind of story this becomes," I said. "Does this end with the mad scientist getting away with his crimes? Or does justice actually mean something?" David's eyes were darting between us, calculating, searching for the right words to regain control. "Helen, I know you're angry, but you need to consider the consequences. If you hurt me, if something happens to me, how will that look? A woman with documented paranoid delusions kills her psychiatrist husband. Sarah would lose both parents, one to murder, one to prison. Who said anything about killing you? Then what? I picked up his phone and dialed 911. Yes, I need to report a kidnapping and assault. My husband has been holding my daughter and me prisoner for 3 weeks, conducting illegal medical experiments. I gave our address and hung up. David stared at me in shock. They'll never believe you. Maybe not, but they'll have to investigate. And when they do, they'll find your research notes, your cameras, your detailed documentation of systematic psychological abuse. That research was legitimate, conducted without informed consent on unwilling subjects, including a minor. I smiled at him and it felt like baring teeth. Tell me, David, did you get IRB approval for your study? Did you file the proper paperwork with the hospital's ethics committee? His silence was answer enough. Because I'm betting when the authorities examine your research, they're going to find a lot of ethical violations, career-ending violations. The sound of sirens was growing closer, and when they interview our neighbors, they're going to hear about how you told everyone we were sick, how you discouraged visitors, how you systematically isolated us from any outside contact. David was pulling frantically at his restraints now. Helen, please, let me loose before they get here. We can say this was all a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that lasted 3 weeks and left our daughter traumatized? I can get help, real help. We can work through this as a family. We stopped being a family the moment you decided we were more valuable as test subjects than as people. The sirens were right outside now. I heard car doors slamming, heavy footsteps on our front porch. Sarah, I said gently, go let them in. She nodded and headed for the stairs, then stopped and looked back at her father. I hope they believe Mom, she said quietly. Because if they don't, if they think she's crazy and you're the victim, then we'll know the system is just as sick as you are. David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, because for the first time in his carefully controlled study, he was facing a variable he couldn't manipulate or predict: the truth. The investigation took 4 months. David was ultimately charged with unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, conducting medical research without proper authorization, and violation of medical ethics. His medical license was revoked, and he received a sentence of 8 years in prison. The hospital settled out of court for an undisclosed sum that would pay for Sarah's therapy and my own recovery. Because I did need recovery, even though I'd been right about everything. The trauma of those 3 weeks, of having my reality systematically dismantled by the person I trusted most, left scars that therapy was only beginning to heal. Sarah was doing better. The medication David had given her hadn't caused lasting harm, and she was working with a therapist to process the betrayal and manipulation she'd experienced. She'd testified against her father with a composure that broke my heart, describing in clear clinical terms how he'd made her complicit in documenting my deterioration. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings or even the media attention that followed. It was the doubt that crept in during quiet moments. Had I overreacted? Had my responses been proportional to the situation? Was there some part of David's assessment that had been accurate? My therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped me understand that these doubts were another form of the gaslighting David had practiced. He'd been so thorough in his psychological manipulation that even knowing the truth, part of me still questioned my own perceptions. Trauma bonds are powerful, she explained during one of our sessions. Your mind is trying to reconcile 20 years of loving someone with the reality of who they actually were. that cognitive dissonance creates doubt, even when the facts are clear. The facts were clear. David's research had been nothing more than elaborate abuse dressed up in academic language. The university had launched its own investigation and found years of ethical violations in his work. Not just what he'd done to us, but corners cut, consent forms forged, data manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. He hadn't been a brilliant researcher conducting groundbreaking studies. He'd been a mediocre psychiatrist whose career was built on exploiting vulnerable people. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined his computer. They found detailed plans for future studies, scenarios where he would manipulate other families, other children, all in the name of advancing his understanding of psychological manipulation. We hadn't been his first victims. We would have been far from his last. The zombie apocalypse he'd created for us was just one of many false realities he'd designed. He'd had contingency plans involving home invasions, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, any scenario that would justify isolation and allow him to study psychological deterioration in a controlled environment. Sarah and I had escaped something much worse than we'd initially understood. I still live in our house. Some people think that's strange, that I should want to get away from the place where it all happened. But this is my home, and I refuse to let David take that from me too. I've had the locks changed, the security system upgraded, and most importantly, I've filled the space with new memories. Good memories. Sarah's friends visiting again, birthday parties, family dinners with my sister and her kids, all the normal, healthy human connections that David had systematically cut away. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those 3 weeks and how close I came to actually losing my mind. Not because of psychological breakdown, but because of the sheer effort required to maintain sanity in an insane situation. The real horror hadn't been zombies outside our door. It had been the monster inside our house, wearing the face of someone I loved, systematically destroying my sense of reality for his own twisted purposes. But I had survived. We both had. And that, perhaps, was the most important documentation of all.